Good morning, and I'm happy to be here. And I'm going to be speaking on climate change and agriculture. Actually, my area of interest is agriculture. The last 25-30 years, I've worked on agriculture and rural economics. I'm new to climate change, and there are experts here, so maybe some of the questions will be answered by the others. But I think this has become a very important issue, whether it's agriculture or any other part of the world. Climate change is a problem which is affecting all of us, all sectors, all people. So I have tried to read and learn about it. And today's lecture, a lot of the reading I have done, a lot of the material I have is from the work of Professor T. Jayaraman. And actually, he will be happy to come to CSES and so on, talk to you also. He was professor at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, retired, now with the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation in Chennai. And his papers and some of the work that I have written with him and some of his other colleagues, Kamal Murari, Sandeep Mahato, and so on, many of these articles, I have the references on the last slide, are published in this journal called Review of Agrarian Studies, of which I'm one of the editors, and it is ras.org.in is the website. It's a public access, open access journal. So those of you who are interested in issues of rural economy, whether it's incomes, production, education, climate, please do look at the website. Okay. Last thing before I start is that I know that you're undergraduate students, and some of the things I'm saying may seem obvious to me, but not to you. So please interrupt anytime if you have seek questions, and this is going to be an interactive session, not my lecture and then some questions. So climate change is upon us, and I don't think there is anybody in this room who is a climate denier. That is change caused in our climatic variables of different kinds. I'll come to them because of human activity. That is what climate change is. And what is its impact on agriculture, agricultural production, on agricultural yields? Am I too close to the mic? This is something that we need to study in India because it is going to affect agriculture. Second main focus is, what is the economic impact of when climate change affects yields of production? Is everybody affected the same way, or are there some inequalities? Is there some differentiated impact? So that's the second point I'm going to argue about, is about the small farmers versus large farmers, or some dry areas of the country versus irrigated. So there's differences in regions of India in many ways, agricultural regions that I'm talking about. So what are the differentiated effects, etc.? The third thing, which is sort of the last part of my lecture, is what has become in the global, climate change affects the whole world. And you all must be hearing about COP26, COP27, the next conference of parties, COP28 is going to be in Dubai, right? In UAE. And the previous one was in Egypt, and the one before that in Glasgow. The countries of the world have to work together, because everybody, whether you like it or not, all of us are going to be affected. But who takes responsibility for what? I think the equity issue in the global debate is very, very important. And it affects choices that we are going to make in India. And maybe I'll give some example from Kerala also in the end. So, or you can ask questions about that. So these are broadly the kind of issues that we're going to look at. So one of the effects of climate change, I'm not going to focus on this. You may be familiar, but just to sort of, what do we mean by climate change? One of the things, global warming and rising temperatures. I think all of you are reading about Europe is having, and US, etc., having record-breaking heat temperatures. And this warming affects, again, I'm not an atmospheric scientist, but affects rainfall, winds, weather, cloudy days, many other things. And this warming, let me assure you, has begun. Now, one of the things in the climate change literature is, unlike in economics, we look at last year's economic growth, this year's economic growth, and we make a big theory about it. In climate change, you have to look at data for at least 50 years or 70 years or 100 years. You can't say last 5 years, even though in our lifetime you may all feel that floods have gone up, but we can't really say that unless we look at long-term data. So 1850 to 2010, India's temperature rise every year is about 0.6 to 0.8 degree centigrade. And again, one thing about India is there's so many regions, there's so many different climatic zones. So sometimes, these averages are not really working everywhere. And as you know, we have minimum temperatures and maximum temperature in a day. These may change differently. It may change in different months differently. And why am I giving you these examples? Because agriculture is seasonal. Agriculture, the crop is in the field for 3 months. So minimum temperature, maximum temperature, the months in which the agriculture is happening, all these become very relevant. For a factory, if you can have fans or air conditioning inside, then the particular days on which minimum, maximum varies may not matter. But obviously for agriculture, it's growing outside in nature, this is very important. And one of the issues that's come up globally is that winter temperatures, the winters are getting warmer, as they say, our minimum temperatures are increasing. And as I will show, this is very important for wheat production in North India. Okay, but just to sum up, already we know that in the last 100 years, temperature has gone up by 1 degree centigrade. Now, is it going to go up globally by 1.5? I think we are going to reach very soon. 2 degrees, this is what people are debating. Now, while the effect of climate change on temperature, how warm or cold it is quite clear and understood scientifically, effect on rainfall and particularly the Indian monsoon is not so clear. Again, I'm not a climatologist, meteorologist, but what I've understand again from reviewing these articles is that because monsoon, this year monsoon started late, as many of you know. The duration of the peak rain was not in June in Kerala, for example, there was a deficit. So this depends on many factors, and is it climate change alone? It's very difficult to gather. Then you have sea level rise, so there are many other things happening, but I'm going to focus here largely on temperature and agricultural production for this lecture, though obviously monsoon is very, very important. Okay? Now, so the worry is that countries like India, global warming or this temperature increase will affect our agricultural productivity. What is productivity or yield? Has anybody heard the term yield of a crop? What are the units? What does it measure? When you say yield of rice in Kerala is, what would you give the answer? What is yield or productivity? Any answers? We won't move further then, we'll be stuck here, so somebody better give some answer.
Measured in tons or metric tons?
Yes, tons per kilo, can even be kilograms. Yeah, tons per hectare, so unit of land. Okay, so by yield I mean how much rice per unit of acre or hectare or any unit. Okay, and it can be kg or ton or whatever, it's quantity per unit of land. So, we have fixed arable land in this country, and already so much land is going for urbanization and building skyscrapers. So, with limited land, we are concerned about how much output per unit of land is produced and whether that will be affected by climate change. And the studies are showing, and I have also done a study, I'll give an example, that there may be a negative effect. That is, the yield may go down because of climate change. Now, I'm going to give examples of that in India, but I'm starting with a global picture. Yes, climate change is going to affect yields in different ways in different countries. It may actually increase it in Europe and so on. They won't have such a big winter. But what is the global trend? So far, luckily for us, the global trend is that agricultural production and productivity are still increasing. That's one point. And secondly, I'll come to that later. I'm just giving the main point and then I'll give the examples and numbers. Second is that if you look at the gap between actual yield in India, does anybody know yield of rice in Kerala? What is the yield of rice? How many kgs per acre or hectare is being produced in Kerala? Average, rough idea. The Kerala average, from what I remember, is about 3 tons per hectare. Though central Kerala, Kuttanad and all will be 6 tons per hectare. Okay? So a ton is a 1000 kg. So 3000 kg per hectare is say being produced. So 4000 kg. All India average is also 3.5, something like that. What is it in China or Japan? Any idea? Just try to guess. Is it less or more?
More.
Yeah, that we all agree. So it's 8, 9 tons average. Average means there is some people getting much higher also and lower. So the point here is that yes, even if our yields are going to be affected, we are, in a way we are lucky. We are still in low, so we have scope to grow. If you're already in 8 tons, then how, if climate change comes, what will you do? So I think these are the two very important general points to keep in mind. And let me just, I don't know, all of you can see that graph at the back? Again, these are given to me by Jayaraman, but different countries, just so that you get an idea. India is in the middle, in the brown, but on top is green is China. As you can see, China is racing ahead in global cereal production. China is on the top of the list, and then is United States, and then is India, and then EU, Africa, Brazil. So it varies across regions, but as of now, what I was saying, we're looking, remember today, at climate change and agriculture. So what is still cereal production? What is cereals? Anybody?
Rice, wheat, spice.
Spice? No.
No, rice, wheat.
Rice?
Wheat.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Rice, wheat, maize, millets. These are cereals. And if you add cereals and pulses, that is all your dals, it becomes food grain. So cereal production is still increasing. And the next slide is cereal yield. Okay? Oh, I didn't see it's written there, right? The title is giving away what a question I asked anyway. Here, US is on the top. So this data is 1961 to 2021. Okay? So as I said, when we're looking at climate issues, 1 year, 2 year, decade, doesn't make sense. We have to look at long-term trends. Again, the second line is US on top, second is China, then EU and Brazil. But India is also growing. India is this kind of line. I don't know if it's working enough. It's the brown line, which is below. So, in terms of the macro picture, we are not bad. I'm not going to talk about this, but we can have in discussion. Is how do we address climate change? Is it by reducing fertilizer? Is it by not having GMOs? These all I'm going to leave for the debate because these are the questions people are asking. But you can see that China, Brazil, India, EU is more or less, except the European Union, fertilizer use is increasing globally. Now, the second point which I made is that the yield gap. Now, this is for rice, and this is a map of the world. I don't know how clear it is, but I will point out India. India is, I think India is quite clear, right? India is here. Now, there is a red and a yellow. So, what is this red? Red is what is the gap? That means for India, the red, as you can see in that pie chart, is bigger than the yellow. It means if our yield is 4 tons, maximum yield is 10, we still have 6 to go. So 6 is the red color, 4 is the yellow. So for different cropping systems, globally you find the world one is right at the bottom here. Globally, the yellow is larger than red. That means more than 50% of potential yield has been achieved. But many countries, and particularly countries in Africa and India, we still have more than 50% of potential. But just for our interest, if you look at, like rice is eaten in Kerala, I'm also a rice eater. If you look at the rice world, which is Asia, okay, all east of India, Southeast Asia, China, Japan, in the rice world, except India, most of them have crossed half of the potential yield. So we are already lagging behind, as I said, China, Japan, Korea, and many other countries. So this is again to illustrate the two big points that I'm making. And I'm going to now maybe give some examples from India on the same issue. So how do yields in India compare with that in other countries? And here wheat, rice and maize is given. Again, I'm only going to focus on one. Let me focus on rice, which is in the middle of the table. If you take the selected 5 countries, China, India, US, Russia and France, the biggest rice producer is India in terms, the biggest area under rice is India in terms of hectares, followed by China and then US, Russia and France. But if you go to production, the ranking is totally different. China is one, then India, US, Russia and France. And if you go to yield, I don't know if you can see the table, doesn't matter. Where is India out of these 5 countries? It's 5th, it's at the bottom. So we are a big producer because we are putting a lot of area under production. But if you look at the yields, so for example, yield of rice is, average yield is 6.5 tons in China, 5 tons in US, 4 in Russia, 5 in France, and 3.2. So this data may be a few years old, I think it's about 3.5 now. But roughly about 3 tons. So this is in a way good news for people like me working in agriculture, that we still have scope for addressing problems which emerge from climate change. And this is again, I thought these graphs looked very nice, so I brought them. Again, what are the yield gaps in rice, but maybe the colors are not so clear. As you can see, the darker the shade, the more the gap. So actually Kerala gap is not so much. Kerala, in the central Kerala, the yield is quite high, 5-6 tons. But central India, eastern India, there's still a very large gap. And one of the issues that we need to is, what is the impact of climate change on yield? But at the same time, we have to, when we are addressing climate change, we have scope in terms of what are the practices, what are the management practices that will bring us higher yields even with climate change. Given our population, and all of you know, we are soon going to cross China's population and be the largest country in the world. We can't rest on our laurels and say we don't need to increase agricultural production. We will need to continue to increase it. And I'll come to the question of small farmers later. Now, second point, which is very interesting, which is made in the climate change literature. I think this will be an issue for all of you, but I won't be alive for 50 years. Now, how do I know what is going to happen in 50 years? Now, one of the things is that a large part of the work in this area is based on modeling. Because we don't know what's going to happen in 50 years, it's based on projections. And I'm not a modeler myself, but I understand from those who do modeling that there are a lot of problems. Any model has problems, and particularly the global agriculture models, I have the names written down, are based on aggregates, averages. They're not looking at Kerala yield or Kerala temperature. Even India, they may take one number. Or for the Asia, South Asia, they may take one number. So these models, the parameters they're using, the assumptions they're making, we really have to question them. And we're going to give an example, not of a model, but of an Indian example later. The second point is that you have, I should have mentioned in the beginning, but You have climate change. So climate change, as I told you, is temperature is increasing, one example. The other is climate variability. A lot of you have experienced here floods and all that, right? That's what I mean by climate variability. Okay? So that is in 1 year, suddenly there's very heavy rainfall, another year there's drought. So this climate extremes, the pattern of climate is, one is steady increase in temperature. The other is how every year or season, variability, as you know, any statistics is standard deviation or the change, okay? The deviation from the mean, a simple example of variability or variation. So climate variability is also increasing. And one thing, I want to read out this sentence because I think it's very, very important. It really helped me clarify my thinking. Conditions of current climate variability and their effect on agriculture provide a useful window into a future of global warming. We don't know what is going to happen in 30 years or 50 years. But by seeing what is happening to agriculture and these different variable effects are happening now, that can help us plan for or adapt or understand what's going to happen in the future. So many people say last 3 years has been floods in Kerala. Oh, that's climate change. See, we know climate change is working. No, that's wrong. That, if you write that sentence in an exam, it is wrong. Because climate change is long term. After 10 years, there may be 10 years of drought. So there were 10 years of floods and 10 years of drought. So what will the average be? We don't know. So what is a long run change in rainfall is one thing. I mean, there are studies on it, but what I mean is by looking at the flood of last 3 years or the drought of last 3 years, you cannot make a statement about climate change. I think it's a very, very important point. As a student, what is the difference between variability and long-term change or mean is a very important distinction. So when you read a newspaper article, oh, 3 years of floods is definitely climate change, you know it's a journalist who doesn't know anything much about climate change. Now, at the same time, and I'm going to give an example of this, role of extremes. Extremes is a variable, right? In temperature and rainfall, they have the most serious effect on agricultural production. And I'm going to give an example of a study that we've done in Karnataka on this. But at the all India level again, because while we are having, high monsoon here, we may be having low rain in Bihar or somewhere else. So again, when you look at the Indian average, what is happening to productivity, it doesn't tell us much. So the other thing I think which is very important for all of you students is, when we have to actually study impact, we need regional studies, we need local studies. It's not just that we can take the global model or the all India average model and say that's what's going to happen wherever we are. So this is, I'm going to come to a study we have done, but this is by some of my young colleagues, not young, Jayaraman, Kamal Murari, Ettis, Mahato. And you can see this is the yield of wheat. So on the x-axis is average temperature. As average temperature increases, yield of wheat is a clear downward sloping straight line, linear relationship. So it's very, very clear. Now, there are a lot of studies for wheat because wheat is grown in Europe and US and many other, Australia, Russia. There are also studies for maize and some studies for rice, but very little studies for other crops. And that's why we decided to do a study in Karnataka for some of these millets, sorghum, finger millet, rice being grown in unirrigated areas. As I said, the more disaggregated analysis we can get, more understanding we have. I'll leave this box plots out of the picture. The next couple of slides, I'm going to take you through a study that I was part of, which the Karnataka government, this was some years ago, asked us to do. What is the impact of climate change on agriculture in Karnataka? So this is from 1900 to 2000. This is the plot of average annual maximum temperature, and you can see that, as happening in India, it's increasing. I showed you this line. What is this? There are lots of scatter plots. These are observations for many years on temperature and yield. And then we tried to find if there is a systematic relationship between these two variables. And that's basically what a regression is. If you look at this graph, you can see that these black dots are going in this direction, right? But to confirm it statistically, we can run a regression. So regression is a regression of yield and on temperature, and you get this straight downward sloping line. That means yes, there is a negative relationship. So how many of you understood this graph, that the downward sloping line is negative relationship? Okay. Huh? Yes or no? I can explain it again. As the temperature increases, the yield decreases, right? Okay. So that's basically what we are going to show in our regression analysis. So I'll just spend a few minutes to the others. So we looked at yield, as I said, of crops that have not been studied so much. And the three climate variables so how does this yield vary with climate variables? We took three. One is total rainfall during this season. As you know, there are Kharif and Rabi. There are two main agricultural seasons, June to September and then December to March in India. We took growing degree days and extreme degree days. I don't think any of you will have heard of it, but so let me just, what does that mean? Basically, we are saying that suppose you have a certain temperature in the growing season. The degree here stands for temperature degree, centigrades. Okay? The growing degree days is the temperature during the days. So suppose you plant in June and you harvest in September. June to September, in these 3 months, we've taken every day's temperature. The second variable is the extreme degree days. Extreme degree days means how many days during that growing season was the temperature greater than what is called the critical temperature. So for example, for sorghum or cholam in Tamil, I don't know what it is in Malayalam, for sorghum, according to the agricultural scientists, 34 degrees is a critical temperature, 34 degrees centigrade. 30 degrees centigrade is the optimal temperature for the crop to grow. So we look at the temperature every day and see on how many days it was above 34. Okay, so that's the EDD or the extreme degree days. And the growing degree days is the temperature as compared to the minimum temperature base for the whole growing season. So anyway, a little bit of econometrics. But what we find is an inverse relationship, that means a negative relationship between extreme degree days and yield for almost all the crops we studied. And we find that this effect of yield is more important, EDD is more important than other climate parameters. So I'm just giving one table from our paper, Extreme Temperatures and Crop Yields in Karnataka, which was published with 3 other colleagues in the Review of Agrarian Studies in 2016, I think, 2016-18. And we took the data at the taluk level. Taluk means, what is taluka? Because why? Again, temperature, in this taluk, morning it was raining in where I was in Edapadi, it's not raining here. So the variations in climate are going to be quite local. So we've taken data, actually this Sandeep Mahato was a student at that time. It takes a lot of time to get taluk level meteorological data and so on. So a lot of effort gone into it by him particularly. Then we took these crops, rice, sorghum, finger millet and pigeon pea, rice with irrigation and without irrigation. And we look, is the yield affected by rainfall, growing degree days and extreme degree days. And I'm only going to focus on this column, on the extreme degree days. And you can see that it is minus, that means negative relationship in all the crops. And 3 stars is highly significant, statistically at a 1% level of significance. So essentially, let me take sorghum, because as I said, rice, wheat, etc. have been studied a little bit in India. But many of these crops which are grown in like millet, finger millet, very nutritious crop grown in Karnataka. Sorghum, these are not studied so much, and we find that clear negative relationship between increase in extreme degree days and yield. So I think one is again the second point which the global studies were showing, and in India the national studies, particularly the Indo-Gangetic Plain for wheat, were showing. We are finding similar results for other crops in other regions of India, and this study which we did is on Karnataka. Okay. Now I'm moving to the next point which I wanted to discuss, which is the impact on small farmers. So you have yield declines because of climate change, you have instability of production. Does this affect everybody in the same way? And I think it's very, very important to understand that at the village level, at the farm level, there is huge inequalities and huge variabilities. So not everybody is affected. And the point is, I'm going to give you some examples from some of these village studies that we have done, as Raki mentioned, in 28 villages across different parts of India. Whether it's yield, whether it's input use, whether it's costs, whether it's incomes, there's huge variability within the village. And in particular, on most parameters, not all small farmers, just to give an example, are worse off than large farmers. So what it means is that not that if there is a flood, the large farmer is not affected, of course, but the large farmer has the resources to recoup and recover. So let's say flooding in the time when you just planted the rice. Then after 3 weeks, when the land is dried out, your crop may be damaged. You may have the money to plant the seeds again or to transplant again. Whereas a small farmer may not. So I think it's very, very important. From national, we have to go to regional effects, but within that we have to look at across economic groups or economic classes. Since you're all economists here, there is differentiation economically, and climate change also has a differential impact. And let me just give a few examples. For example, taking an average of 8 villages that we studied, this is an article in our journal, we took all the households in these 8 villages and we ranked them by level of income. So the poorest household is first and the richest is last, and then you create deciles. So bottom 10%, poorest 10%, okay? Now the poorest 10%, the average of these villages, their income from crop production was negative, minus 19,000. The richest 10%, their income was, average of a very district, 60,000 rupees. Actually, if you look at very rich, it will be more. But this is a whole lot of villages. So what are we saying? We are saying that you have huge differences even without climate change. Even in a year which is not a drought year or a flood year or a year of very extreme temperature, even without that, you have huge inequalities within villages. And some of these inequalities we have discussed in this book called How Do Small Farmers Fare, where we've looked at the data from many of these villages. So as far as climate change is concerned, the 3 sort of broad conclusions, I can give more examples, but these are not on my slides, so I'm not going to go into them. We find negative crop incomes across these villages. How can somebody have negative income? Is that possible? No, my answer is correct, negative income. What does it mean? If a farmer has negative income? Loss. You spent on seeds, you spent on inputs, you spent on harvesting, and then the yield was very low and the price crashed. Onion prices keep falling or something, and you were not able to you earned 1,000 rupees, you spent 1,500. So that's a loss of 500. So we find that except in the Punjab, in that Green Revolution belt, in every village we find at least some households having negative incomes. And of course, it's more likely that small farmers like in Andhra and so on, we found very big difference. Large farmers are earning in lakhs, and small farmers are making negative incomes. In Kerala, outside plantation, that I think the inequality in landholding is not so much. But if you go to central India or Punjab or Andhra, you can easily have 100-acre farms and 5-acre farms. So we looked at different classes of peasants and different size class of land holdings, and again we see these differences. So at one hand there are households with negative incomes. At the same time, in the same village, there are households with high incomes. So again, the impact of climate change, say the yield decline, for example, suppose there's a temperature increase and yield decline. The impact of this in terms of costs and incomes is going to be very different. And this is very relevant for the last point I'm going to come to about adaptation. So now I turn to policy issues. And I would like to spend a few minutes on global policy and India's role, and then come more to our thing. So again, this is something that I think is very much part of the global discussions and debates which are happening in COP and elsewhere. And that is, this whole climate change is because of the greenhouse gas emissions, right? So don't think about the numbers, how many gigatons and all is not important. But I think what I want to show here is, if you take, again, if you look at, there's a website called climateequitymonitor.in, which is linked to the Swaminathan Research Foundation and NIAS. You will get a data on every country on all equity parameters. The point we're making here is that up to 1990, from 1850, that is sort of start of industrial revolution, till 1990, 71% of global emissions came from the rich countries. Annex 1 countries refers in some annex of these declarations to the global north or the rich countries. Okay? And 29%, 71 came from the rich countries, 29 came from the rest, the countries of the global south. If you take the last sort of 20 years, 1990s till 2018, last 20, 30 years, that share has changed a little bit. It's 46% from the global north, 54% from the global south, and that's mainly because of China, and then a little bit because of India. But if you take the share of global population in 2018, the rich countries have only 18%, and the poor have 82%. So what are we trying to say here? I don't want to go into too many numbers and differences and so on. What is the basic global inequality here? So who has contributed the most to climate change in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? The rich countries, the north, whatever, Annex 1, whatever we call it. And now, but who is going to bear the burden of it? 82% of the population is in the south. So climate change, rainfall pattern change, temperature change is affecting us, it's affecting everybody, wherever you live in the world. So the burden is going to be borne by 82% of the population. Now the question therefore in policy is whether it's net zero, whether it's cutting down diesel or use, shifting to electric cars. Again, all of us have to do it. But where is the burden going to fall? Who is going to take more responsibility? And you don't need to guess. Obviously, the North is trying to put the blame now on China and India. I mean, very crudely speaking, but I think that's what. So I think the main point I want to say here is, and this is, I just have a quote from a report on food security and climate change in 2014 by the high-level panel of experts of FAO, which was actually chaired at that time by Ms. Swaminathan. That even then, that none of these global issues are addressing distributional issues, distributional inequality issues within countries, and the extent or the possibility that climate change affects the vulnerable disproportionately. Okay? So I think whenever we read, any of you, when you go on to your PG or anywhere else, you read a United Nations report, or you read an FAO report, or you read the report from the COP26, we think these are international bodies and therefore they reflect the voices of all countries. But please look for the distributional or equity parameter there. how are different countries being treated. Okay, I'll not go into this. Yeah, maybe I'll look, if you look at the second quote here, again from that same report. See, already the small farmer in India has to spend a lot on seeds, has very little access to agricultural extension or to crop insurance. So the small farmer is already disadvantaged even before climate change has hit her or him. And so when we talk about adaptation policies, whether it is Kerala or elsewhere, I think even before, we can discuss this, I can be criticized, but I think even before we talk about adaptation to climate change, we have to talk about adaptation of that small farmer who is earning a negative income. How do we get him or her out of that? You know? So these two things are linked up, and I don't think in the international reports basically what are the problems of small farmers, how is it regionally differentiated, how is it differentiated in terms of economic class. These are things that are challenges for climate change. Okay, I'm not going to go into all this. Let me just say a sentence about this. This is again not my area, but net zero. Have you all heard the term net zero? At least in the newspapers. India has announced net zero. That's different because some things are political. You're in global negotiations, and every country has to show that they're doing something. We need to also, because as I said, whether we like it or not, we're going to be affected. So, for example, solar energy, wind energy, big effort happening. I think that's quite impressive. China has gone much more. Electric vehicle production, China is much more than any other country in the world now. So, we all have to move to this, and the sooner we start doing it, the better. But I think we have to think about, can this be done at, I've already mentioned this, that, what is the main, if you're sitting here today, many of you experienced floods, what is the main issue today? Is it mitigation, that is reducing our carbon footprint, or is it adaptation? And again, I'm going to take a very strong view on this, that it is adaptation. Okay? So again, as a policy issue, please think about this. Mitigation means reduction. Okay? So, is India's role and Kerala's role to help the global mitigation? To some extent, yes. But we are 82% of the population, not India, but the global south. Even now, even if it's in the last 15 years, it's 50% of the global emissions are from the developing countries. And if you look at historically, it's less than 20%. So who should bear the burden of mitigation? So those countries who, where everybody has 2 cars or 3 cars, they have to start. It's not that we can't do it. I think 2-car families in Kerala also, there we can do it. But is that the emphasis in policy here? Okay, so I'm not saying we don't do any mitigation, but I think adaptation is what we need to focus on. And coming more to agriculture. I was giving examples of cars and all that, but that's not my area. My area is agriculture. We really need to look at the current constraints. Why are yields and incomes so low from these villages? In June, I was in 2 weeks in a village in Uttar Pradesh, in eastern UP. It was so depressing. So much poverty there and other things. What is our problem now? Our problem is those small farmers in those UP villages or elsewhere. How do we improve their living conditions? How do we improve their incomes? How do we give them better irrigation facilities, better seed quality, help them with mechanization or whatever? Okay, how do we increase their output, their productivity, their incomes? Maybe outside agriculture also. And I think adaptation strategies in India have to, focus on these issues. So I'll end now because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions. Just a few pointers to what I've been trying to say. One is, please don't confuse climate change with climate variability. These are 2 very different concepts. And climate change, long run is happening. Climate variability is also, in fact, somebody the frequency of occurrence of extreme events, floods, droughts, typhoons, etc. is increasing. That is the climate variability. So both things are happening. The mean is changing, variability is changing, but don't confuse the two. The mean and the variance are different. Second is yield growth in India, luckily, is still on a positive trend, and there are yield gaps. But if we don't pay attention, this climate change will affect the yield levels. We are going to have a lot of problems. And the last point here is there's an agrarian crisis. What do I mean by agrarian crisis? I told you that every village we studied, there are households with losses every year. So what is this? This is a crisis of incomes. So, but is it only due to climate change? I don't think so. It's been there for many years. So we sometimes, just because climate change is so important, we forget the other reasons or the other factors that many economists have been studying for a long time. And just to give you one example, a few years ago there was a paper by a woman, Tanya Kalchan, I think, she's the US PhD scholar, who did a regression in India and showed that temperature and suicides are related. Now, this is a totally spurious correlation, but myself, Jairam and Kamal Murari, we sent a reply. Her article was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and they published a letter also with a critique. I mean, she had not even differentiated between Kharif and Rabi crops. So yes, there are suicides in central India and in Madhya Pradesh or Maharashtra. Is that because of climate change? I mean, that's a little extreme. So it's a little easy to put everything on climate change, and these kind of papers are being published in the most reputed journals. National Academy of Sciences of the US, one of the most reputed scientific academies. So I think we have to be a little careful with this, putting all the blame for everything on climate change. And lastly, that global equity issues, given that Kerala and India must focus on adaptation. And I have some of the articles I've referred to today by Jayaraman, by Kamal Murari, they're my colleagues also in Review of Agrarian Studies. As I said, it's available online, so if you want to look at it later, you can. Thank you very much.